We're jumping right back into the book of Mark again today, and we want to focus on the latter part of chapter 1. I've already shared with you several thoughts from the early aspect of the chapter. Let me just really quickly, about three things I'll just notice with you. First off, of course, was John the Baptist and that Jesus was baptized by him. And then you have Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, and then he called his disciples and began to teach. So that's kind of a quick summary of the first part of the chapter. And now as we get down, actually last time I think we focused on verse 22, where Jesus taught with authority, which was kind of our cap sheep on last time. Now we get into three miracles. There are others mentioned as well, but three miracles in particular that I want to notice with you today that are found in the last part of this chapter. So let's look at them together today. And the first one we notice is in verse 23. It begins telling us there was right there in the synagogue, right? I don't know all the details of that, but he was right there in the synagogue, this man with an unclean spirit, we might say demon-possessed, that kind of thing. And so he cries out, he recognizes the demon, that is, cries out using the man's voice probably. And he says, "Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth?" And then he even goes on a little further and says, "I know who you are." And at this point, Jesus maybe wasn't quite ready for him to be proclaimed in quite this way. You can find other places, it seems, where Jesus said, "You just hold your peace." And that kind of thing. In fact, is right here in verse 25. He says, "Hold thy peace." I don't know exactly if he's saying just you be quiet. Don't be broadcasting that right now. But then he casts the demon out, and the people were amazed and were questioning, how does he have this sort of authority and power? And then Jesus entered in. Of course, you remember the last time we focused on 4 disciples that Jesus called. Simon Peter and Andrew, his brother, and then James and John, his brother. So you have those 4, and right here we have Peter, or Simon Peter. His mother-in-law was the one who was sick of a fever, and they came and they told Jesus about her. So he came apparently into the house where she was lying in bed, I assume. It seems to be the case. And she is raised right up and ministered to them. And so that's the second miracle that Jesus did there. Then you see several other examples of miracles. We'll get back to that in just a moment. But then jump down to verse 40, and there came a leper to him, beseeching him and kneeling down to him, saying, "If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." What a wonderful note of faith that is. And Jesus said, I will. I would like to do this. Be thou clean. And so then in verse 44, Jesus said, don't be telling everybody. It goes back kind of to what I mentioned about the demons proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. Right here he says something similar. "See thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing those things which Moses commanded for a testimony unto them." But he went out and began to publish it much. Now, I understand in one sense we would say, well, he disobeyed Jesus. And yet in another sense, I have a feeling that Jesus knew very well that something like that you can't keep quiet about. And yet it was perhaps going to be a hindrance to Jesus' ministry. And I'll leave that to your discretion. Obviously, he wasn't obeying totally, but there is a part of that I believe Jesus was pleased with the praise. And so anyway, I want to just quickly, I'll write on the board here the three miracles, those 3 that I mentioned to you, and I'm just going to mention it or kind of use it this way. The first one, you notice that he showed his authority over the devils, and in another sense, we might say he showed his power over those who are bound. He was more than sufficient to overcome the devil. The next one we might notice is Peter's mother-in-law. We might just call her the distressed ones, and we might say the distressed. And then I'm going to call her, at least, she was bedfast. And for these two, we would maybe say there's not a whole lot they could do for themselves. In a sense, the devil had control of the man who was bound. What's he supposed to do? Yeah, there maybe was some sort in moments of clarity in his mind. Maybe there'd be something that he could say, oh, if I could just get to Jesus. But we don't know of that happening. Then you have the distressed one, and it seems as though she's probably bedfast and not able even to call on Jesus necessarily. I don't know whether she was responsive necessarily. Maybe she was. Maybe she smiled when Jesus came in. We don't know all of that. But these two are a little bit of a different level. And then whenever I see this last one, Jesus showed his power over the devils, over the distresses of life, and over the disease. This man is probably looking at a death sentence because of leprosy in that time. But I just want to call to your attention his belief. Because, yes, we can say that Jesus just stepped in for the man who was bound. Wasn't much for him to do. The woman who's bedfast with the distress of this fever, human physical ailments, that kind of distress, she may not have been able to do much for herself either. But this man facing a death sentence, diseased, the off-scouring, the outcast, all those things, he's supposed to be separated from society, but he showed great belief. And I want you to notice that in this passage. Yes, Jesus could heal the man who was bound. And yes, he could step in for this woman who, very well, it says she was laying there. Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, very possibly bedfast. She may not have been able to do much for herself either. But then you have this bright spot that Jesus could just, kind of maybe smile even whenever the man says, "If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." There are two things about that. Number one, obviously, he's saying, I have faith in you. And number two, he's saying, you do have all power. Of course, they go right hand in hand. But God's power combined with this man's faith, and it worked together. And so Jesus very simply says, I will. In some ways, I'd like to suggest anyway, he might just be saying in those few words, I'd be happy to. Your faith is just a blessing to me. And so he says, I will, be thou clean. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately, those two words, remember that other word that Mark uses so often? Straightway, right away. As soon as, and then he uses the word immediately. And fact is, you might even go so far as to say possibly the word straightly in verse 43 might kind of convey somewhat that idea, but probably more involved in a very diligent charging or instruction for him. But anyway, this man showed his faith, and then he showed his excitement in not being able to keep it quiet, and went and told the others. One other one I want to notice with you, maybe a couple of other things. You may question a little bit. In verses 32 through 34, we read about some other healings as well. They're not specified. We don't know who all that they were. I've given you 3 that are specified, but you see some others. And it says here in verse 32, and at even, that's evening, that's what it's referring to, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased. Why was it then? There may have been some different ideas involved here. We don't know maybe altogether just what the purposes were. Some would maybe say, well, it maybe was because that was when these people that could bring the sick, when they're off work, when they're out of the fields, whatever it may be. But it seems as though right in this chapter, this time frame, we're talking about the Sabbath day. And so it begins at 6 o'clock in the evening and goes through 6 o'clock the next morning. That's the evening. That begins the day at 6 o'clock in the evening. Then you go through the day till 6 o'clock in the evening, which begins the next day. So I hope that's clear. I maybe didn't make that real clear there, but the idea is that Sabbath began at 6 o'clock on the evening before what we would call the Sabbath. Of course, for us, we use Sunday, but for them it was Saturday. And this would be Friday evening at 6 o'clock, and then go all the way through till Saturday evening at 6 o'clock. And so what it's saying here is now, finally, the Sabbath is over. The sun is set, 6 o'clock has come, we might say. And so now these people can feel free to bring their sick ones. It was sort of taboo to bring the sick. Jesus actually ran into trouble by those who felt like you shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath day. And of course, that's another part of the study. But anyway, that is very possibly why they waited until evening. And they were waiting. Of course, Jesus earlier in the chapter had been teaching in the synagogue. It was their Sabbath day. Now they wait until after Sabbath is over. And then they bring their sick. One other one I'll just notice with you quickly is right after Jesus had healed the man with the devil and Simon's mother-in-law, and then this number, whoever all it was, in verses 32 through 34, in verse 35, and in the morning, rising up a great while before day, he went out and departed into a solitary place and there prayed. Jesus was giving out a lot, emotionally and spiritually. He was giving to the people, but he recognized his need also to be, shall I say, in a fresh way infilled. And so he knew that need. And so a great while before day, he rose up. I need a fresh filling. I need God's special presence on me for the job today. And so you find him there as well. I believe we had something similar to that. Of course, he had just been praying in the wilderness earlier in the chapter. And then here he's going out a great while before day to pray during those early hours to seek after God. Just a little suggestion for you. It seems, at least my experience, and of course it goes along with Jesus, it seems like sometimes the best time to pray is early in the morning. Before we get started in all the other activities, it's a good thing just to spend some time with God before we get everything clouding our minds. And so just throw that in as we bring this chapter to a close. Let's make sure we're following Jesus' example, spending time in prayer. And I'm sure I've said that probably in the earlier time there when Jesus was praying in the wilderness. But just again a reminder to follow Jesus' example. Make sure you spend the early hours with him. I'm not saying, obviously different people are different in there, whether you're a night person or a morning person. I'm not giving you a certain time. I'm just saying, before you get into all the other activities of the day, try to follow Jesus' example and spend some time with him. Well, God bless you until next time. And you can start into chapter 2. That's just a quick rundown. We have a lot of verses right there, but I tried to give you at least a quick overview of those. And those of you that know me at least and have my number, you can text me if you have questions and would like for me to respond personally to that. Be glad to do that as well. Well, God bless you. Have a great week.